Welcome back to DemystifySci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
And this is the podcast where we explore the theories that might change the way we see the universe. And today we are looking at the missing link between physics and conscious processes, which is a really interesting gap because, as you may well understand, physics is at the top of the hierarchy in terms of academic study of causation, right? It's a highly mathematical discipline, very rigorously defined and empirically verified. And it has a really hard time coming to grips with what's happening in this room right now. A bunch of atoms piled together, investigating themselves.
And with us for this conversation, we have Dr. Tiffeny Todd, who is the Department Chair of Physics at Pierce College, and she's been working on a theory that she calls vacuum orchestrated spin signaling, called VOS, which is a mechanistic theory that attempts to explain how minds are able to affect reality. And so, in order to go into this conversation, you kind of have to assume that there is something about the mind's ability to affect reality that is legitimate. So, like parapsychology, the efficacy of psychics, the ability of laboratories to measure the deviation from random chance due to thoughts being directed at quantum experiments. And so, the spirit of the program is that we explore ideas that may be true. And this is definitely one of those things that falls into that bin because parapsychology research as a whole is still up for debate. There's lots of labs that have been working on this for decades that purport to have found really, really strong evidence for the ability of the human mind to direct reality. Other labs try to reproduce the research, and they're successful only to varying degrees. But I think that it's fair to say that most phenomena that end up being accurate and verifiable begin their life as something that most people can't actually show. Like, I always think about electromagnetic theory. Like, it took a really, really long time until Faraday was able to demonstrate some kind of direct relationship between electricity and magnetism, and Maxwell to quantify that into the thing that we use now to design all of the technologies that we're using in this room. And so, ideas have their moment, and that moment sometimes takes a really long time to come to fruition because there's all of these people that are trying to figure out how to actually describe the phenomenon. What are the conditions under which the phenomenon is actually happening? And so Tiffeny had a psychic experience. She had an out-of-body experience. And this kicked her off onto the study of parapsychology. And because of her physics background, she was curious to see if there's something inside of physics that could tell us about the way that agency and will and experience exists outside of the body, rather than being something that is generated de novo by the pure function of the brain.
Yeah, do you enjoy this conversation, if you enjoy conversations like this, if you are new to the podcast, I hope you'll stick around and check out some of the other conversations we've had because this is a huge bin of topics and it extends all the way from quantum physics to cosmology. Speaking of cosmology, if you want to hang out in person this summer, we are bringing together a crack team of theorists to discuss the crisis in cosmology. It is drawing very, very near, and we only have a few tickets left, so if that interests you, check out DemystifySci.com and see if you can join up with the Demysticon project and get involved for an in-person gathering this summer in Sesimbra, Portugal from June 12th to the 16th. If you can't make it out to Portugal, remember, this project is entirely supported by you guys. We work directly for you. And if you are already supporting this project, thank you so much. If you enjoy the project and you're not yet supporting it, remember, you could do that for as little as 75 cents a week, which seems like almost nothing to you probably, but it all adds up to making sure that Anastasia and I can spend all of our time dedicated to bringing you better and better conversations. So I would love to see you over at patreon.com/demystifysci.
And if you have a theory of nature that you want to drop onto the world, then come to Paradigm Drift. It is a new show that we are doing where we allow theorists that have ideas to come onto the show. You get 60 seconds to present your idea. Then we conduct a little interview with you. We have a panelist with us. We have some live music. It's a lot of fun. And we tape them live. The next taping is May 9th at 6:30 p.m. Eastern. Signups are at the link below. They're also right up here. And so we hope that we see you there, because Paradigm Drift is the newest, coolest place to share your ideas with the world.
I hope you guys enjoy our musings on the quantum vacuum as we try to make sense of how it is that atoms communicate with one another across the void.
The scientific revolution starts now.
DemystifySci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
Oftentimes, parapsychology lives somewhere that's very far away from physics, right? You have people that are just seers and crystal balls and tinkly bells, and they can tell you about, your like great uncle who wants to have a message for you. But then as you bring it closer and closer into the realm of science, like how has that been? How is the process of getting these ideas in front of people been, especially with what you said about, we have this set of rules for what counts as a reliable source and how we evaluate evidence. And a lot of this stuff seems like it's, marginal effects or really small effects that show up in studies, which when you start to probe much more deeply, they kind of disappear or things like that. And so what's your experience been like?
I mean, I think the scientific community's overall stance on parapsychology is largely valid. I mean, exactly to your point, there are issues with the veracity of the evidence at this point. And also, I think there's three main issues, well, maybe four. One, all of the work in parapsychology is not being done by physical scientists, physicists, biologists, chemists, right? It's being done by psychologists, where if this phenomenon is actually real, then we have a non-locality happening. I always say that, two things that are psychically connected are entangled. That's the closest idea that we have in physics. So I always like to think entanglement is psychic. But so if that's the case, then parapsychology wouldn't be a psychological phenomenon. It would be a physical phenomenon and would have to be rooted in the physical sciences. So I think the biggest issue is we have no laws of physics, chemistry that could at this point explain how such a thing could be possible, right? Even when you take quantum entanglement, the way we've understood it up until recently has been that even when you have two entangled objects, they're created locally, right? Say you create two particles out of energy, right? Equals mc squared. Because you're creating those particles from nothing, the sum of their angular momentum has to add up to zero, right? For conservation of angular momentum. So one has to have the property of spin up, the other has to have the property of spin down. Their spins have to be opposite. So no matter where you separate them in the universe, they're going to be correlated where they have to have opposite spins. And of course, you can think, well, maybe the spins are inherent to those objects when you create them. Say you create two balls and one is red, one is blue, and you put them in a box and you don't know which is red, which is blue, but you separate them. Their color was defined when they were created, and it's static and it's permanent and it's forever. But that's not what happens with entangled particles. What happens with entangled particles is when you measure their color, there's a 50-50 chance that they could be red or blue. On the other hand, if you measure the direction those balls are spinning, there's a 50-50 chance one is spinning clockwise, the other counterclockwise. So if you measure their spin, and one is clockwise and the other counterclockwise, and then you measure color, then when you measure spin again, there's still a 50-50 chance of what their spins could be. But at this point, they're separated. So how could they coordinate to be opposite to one another in this particular characteristic when they're so far apart that they're outside one another's light cones? They're space-like separated, meaning that they couldn't communicate via light signaling because light travels at the speed of light. Obviously, that takes time. And so they're causally not connected, meaning one cannot causally communicate with the other within an instantaneous time frame. And so that's entanglement. It's almost like it seems like these two particles are psychically connected, right? That somehow they're coordinating to have the opposite properties, even when they don't know what property is going to be measured yet. But the way you get around sort of faster than light communication is that these particles were created locally, right? And so that's sort of been the rationale for how could two minds be psychically entangled, right? Two minds are not two particles created together in a lab, right? So there's no physical mechanism in physics in which two minds could have been entangled. I think Dean Radin wrote the book Entangled Minds. And while the idea of it looking similar to psychic phenomenon, the physics doesn't really support a mechanism by which parapsychology could happen. So back to your question, I think one, we don't have physical science studying parapsychology. Two, there's no physical mechanism that could even explain how such a thing could be possible, how psychic phenomenon could be possible. And then I think you brought up the other two issues is the reproducibility of the studies has been an issue. And also the effect size, where depending on the statistical analysis you use, you see effects or results that are greater than chance, but barely so. Take the PEAR experiments, PEAR, from the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab. These were decades of studies conducted by the head of the engineering department at Princeton. And what he did is he had a random number generator that generated a binary outcome. Think of a quantum coin flip. So these random number generators are based on a quantum process, say electron tunneling, and the timing between successive electron tunneling events. Just to explain what electron tunneling is, you have an electron in an energy barrier that it can't escape, but every now and then it gets enough energy to escape the barrier. And you cannot predict when that tunneling event is going to occur. It's completely random. And how you can create a binary outcome out of that is by saying, was the last tunneling event greater than or less than the previous one? Greater than, less than is your binary outcome. So that's how you now have a quantum random number generator. That's like a quantum coin flip. It gives you a random binary outcome. And what they did at PEAR is they had people try to influence the outcome of the coin flip with their mind. Can you, instead of having an outcome of 50-50 heads, tails, can you nudge ever so much the outcome of many, many coin flips to be slightly more heads or slightly more tails? And over decades, they did these experiments and they found statistical significance. But it was small, so it was easy to dismiss. In terms of reproducibility, I would say it was hard for them to publish their work. I think some journals were like, well, if you can, I've had parapsychologists report, if you can teleport your results to me, then I will publish them in our journal. So there's this sort of cynical, even disregard to even take the time to look at the evidence. I question how many scientists who are not in the field of parapsychology would actually take the time to delve deeply into the research when we're so specialized right now. We have so little time to sort of review the research in our own field, that to take the time to really investigate and dive into something that is likely, that you feel is a goose chase, I question the veracity of review that the parapsychology studies have actually received, especially when it's presented by maybe a neurologist or a medical physician or a psychologist. I don't know how many physical scientists really are paying attention to that research. But I think this is changing. There's been two new experimental results that I think are sort of tipping the scales here that we need to give this a second look. So first of all, on these psychokinesis studies, there's a researcher, Morris Friedman, who recently did a series of experiments repeating the pair experiments. But what he did is he had a hypothesis that psychic phenomenon is rare. It's meant to be. I was at the Science of Consciousness conference, and someone was presenting on parapsychology, and a scientist said, okay, if psychic phenomenon is real, why is it so rare? Why aren't we all psychic? Why don't we see it all the time? Why is it so hard to measure? And Morris Friedman thought, well, maybe that's by design. Maybe when we see psychic phenomenon, it's because something has gone wrong, a sort of glitch in the matrix. We know biology is not, evolution, things don't work perfectly all the time. So maybe something's gone wrong. So he thought maybe the brain is a filter. Maybe it's filtering out psychic information. Like the body is sort of like a lens, sort of focusing all of our perceptions, all of our input information, and all of our processing. So what he did is he discovered a region of the brain that's known in neuropsychology to sort of be the center of forming our identity, our sense of self, our sense of boundaries. And an organism really has to define what is me and what is the environment. That's very fundamental to identity, even at the cellular level. Michael Levin's done a lot of interesting work around how do cells form that boundary to determine what is me, what is the environment. The source of cancer is when a cell determines that its neighbors are no longer part of itself, but are now separate from itself and environment. And this region of the brain that determines our sort of identity or forms it, what he did is he used RTMS, which is these magnetic coils, to create temporary brain lesions in that area to suppress the activity of the region of our brain that forms our identity. And what he found is that
What region is that, by the way? Sorry.
Oh, goodness, I can look it up for you.
Is it like some prefrontal cortex stuff?
For the medial region
interesting.
on the left. It's definitely the left. When he tried on the right, it doesn't work because I think that the same region on the right allows you to focus. So you need the ability to still focus, but you need sort of a loosening of the boundaries of your sense of self and identity.
That reminds me of, there was a lady who had a crazy stroke. And I don't...
Taylor?
Yes, Jill Bolte Taylor, I think. And she talks about this specifically, and obviously I can't remember which hemisphere was the stroke, but she talks about that the hemisphere that the stroke was in was instructive in constructing the barriers between self and other. And so she had this internal view of all of these boundaries aggressively dissolving as she was dealing with the fact that she was no longer really herself, and the world was no longer itself. It was just kind of this smearing, which is crazy. Like, you wouldn't expect that to be something that the brain does, right? Like, isn't that kind of weird?
It's a heck of a story, yeah. She's everybody should check out her TED Talk if they haven't already.
Yeah, I saw her years ago on Oprah's Soul Series. She's been interviewed, with Oprah. Fascinating how she describes that. And I think that's what we're talking about. Also psychedelics as well. There's sometimes people who have therapeutic benefit from psychedelics. One of the key differences is everyone sort of reaches this panic point where they feel like their sense of self or this ego dissolution is about to be lost. And those that are able to push through actually get the benefits, the therapy benefits of, improving their post-traumatic stress disorder, etc. Whereas those that don't break through that sort of ego dissolution barrier don't get the same level of benefits. And in these psychedelic studies, patients talk about when they do break through, having the sense of oneness, this sort of oceanic oneness. So there does seem to be something.
Like, not to totally derail you, but didn't you have a
No.
mystical experience yourself that was at the core of your redirection towards a lot of this work? I got that from the documentary.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why I opened with this sort of out-of-body experience that I had. Um, I think the theory that I point to is one where mind isn't emergent from the physical of the body. That the brain is really an antenna that's receiving signal of mind. And I think it's sort of, had I not had a visceral experience of that, I think that would have been hard to sort of believe something like that could be possible. Um, but I think what's happening is that the brain is like a focusing mechanism. It's like a lens. It's like a filtering of the perceptions that we have.
What I
So
want
that
to understand, like, why you. So oftentimes people hear psychedelic experiences, mystical experiences, out of body experiences, and if they haven't experienced these things themselves, they might be able to write them off as hallucinations, right? And even like a lot of these pharmacological compounds, whether they're natural or synthesized, they're termed hallucinogens, right? And so, and how would you say that that experience was in some sense more real than everyday reality, or what was it about it that convinced you that it wasn't just a hallucination?
Hmm.
I try to capture this in the documentary. It became so obvious to me when I was out of body. It was like remember, it's like waking up from a dream. Oh, how did I forget that this is me? How silly of me. Why did I think I was a body? Of course this is me. Like it's so obvious. That said, to your point, either argument could be made, right? I think it could have been a hallucination, right? But I think the question is then we would need scientific evidence to support one worldview. What I'm proposing is a heliocentric model versus a geocentric model. Either consciousness emerges, it's an emergent phenomenon from the physical neurons, from physical cells, or the way cells are organized and arranged and their number, that networking somehow gives rise to consciousness. In that case, then yes, it could just be, it would be probably a hallucination because there is no mind separate from that physical. But if you take the other viewpoint, then if mind is an antenna that's receiving the signal, then it is possible for if you break the antenna, if you break the television, it doesn't mean the broadcast has stopped. So I think to your point, we can't say if what I experienced was just a hallucination or not, unless we actually can have empirical evidence to support one of those worldviews, the heliocentric or the geocentric. Is matter creating consciousness or is consciousness moving matter, as I'm proposing?
Don't you think there's like a pretty soft version of this hypothesis too, which everybody would agree to, where we are antenna as social creatures in a universe full of other beings that are constantly informing us about better and worse ways to live and how to collaborate on a future that's mutually beneficial, right? It's like there is some element of being a being versus being a rock, where beings, especially social beings, like it's just the softest version of this I can imagine, which is that we're obviously antennas to some extent, right? Like before we even start to investigate the physics of how that works, we certainly have as beings some antenna-like aspect of our existence. Like you take the worst way you can punish a human being is putting him in solitary confinement. Like that'll kill someone basically eventually, right? We definitely depend on each other to make ourselves in the future. My thought is just that there's something really special about being beings are special types of bodies, I guess is the way I look at it, right? It's like, if we just define a body in the classical sense of like Descartes and Newton, it's just kind of this object which has physical surfaces that distinguish it from the inside versus the outside. It has some location with respect to all the other physical bodies in the universe. There's something special about us and my cat and the trees outside, where they're constantly becoming something new. They're not this statically conceived physical body, right? You can't imagine a person without a person in motion. It's kind of just doesn't make sense in that sense. And so there's something special about us, which I worry if we confuse it with the body in general, like if we confuse ourselves with our bodies, we're like already sort of barking up the wrong tree a little bit, because I'm going to have totally different atoms 7 years from now, or whatever the latest calculation on that is. But I'll still be here, and that's crazy. So I will be a completely new material, but I'm still here, right? So I must be something that exists dynamically across time. Whereas, a physical body can just be conceived statically, like you can just take a picture of it or draw, you can have this kind of really static conception of physical bodies. So anyways, I think that there's a very soft angle on all of this, which might start with explaining to people like, hey, look, we already do a lot of antennaing to begin with. What other ways might that be happening in to explain these very bizarre results that we see occasionally?
Yeah, I think I agree with you 100%. And I think that's a really great way for sort of anyone to just have an entry point into this concept or this idea, right? Um, I think there's sort of two ways of explaining fundamentally where consciousness comes from. There's sort of the neurologist way, and then there's the physicist way.
Hmm.
And I think Michael Levin has really done a lot of amazing work at saying, well, where does that distinctness that you talk about, right? The distinctness of biological beings, this sort of cognitive agency, the ability for associative learning, where does that start? And he's been probing down to the cellular level, and finding this agency, not just in a fully formed human body or an animal, but we have evidence of associative learning in plants now, right? Or,
What's
even
which examples are you thinking of when you say in plants?
Gagliano did an experiment where she did the Pavlov's dog experiment with pea shoots, pea plants, where, of course, with Pavlov's dog, it naturally salivates when dinner arrives. And if you present dinner along with the ringing of a bell, initially, if you just ring the bell, the dog doesn't salivate alone. But if you associate the ringing of the bell with the presentation of dinner, the dog begins to learn that, oh, the ringing of the bell signals that dinner is about to come. And so eventually, even when no dinner is present, when the dog hears the bell, it starts to salivate. So the dog has learned that the bell means dinner. It's able to remember that information. And when the bell rings, it's able to imagine that dinner is coming, even though dinner isn't right in front of that. So that's a high level of learning and memory. It's a high level of cognition. It's really a hallmark of sort of agency and cognitive agency. And what Monica Gagliano did is it's amazing how she discovered this. We were talking about psychedelics. She went on a dieta, I think in Peru, and through her deep meditations, and on these substances, she says the plant spoke to her. So her book is
Wait,
called.
what was that plant? I've never heard of that one. Sorry.
She went on a spiritual quest. It's called the dieta,
Yeah.
where she drinks, I think, ayahuasca.
I see.
Instance, but in the very sort of traditional sense, I think under the guidance of locals who have been engaged in this tradition for many generations. And during these visions, she said the plant spoke to her and literally showed her the experiment to do. She's like, we want to show you as plants what we're capable of. And this is the piping you should use. This is everything. So again, was that the plants communicating with her, or was it this life form on some level, or was it just a hallucination just that opened up her mind to ideas that were already kind of there and just allowed her to process ideas more quickly? Who
And
knows?
so what, in the end of the day, did the experiment look like? Did she ring a bell for the plants, or?
So instead of a bell, she used a fan. Okay. And the plants can definitely sense breeze and fans, but they don't particularly care about it. But what they do care about is dinner, which in this case was blue light. And so she would randomly choose the direction that blue light would come from upon sunrise. It takes a lot of energy for a plant to bend towards the light. So before the day starts, it has to pick, where am I going to bend? And normally what happens is it will bend in the direction where the sunlight was the day before. But she was randomly switching this on the plant. And so what she did is she associated the direction of the light with the direction a fan was blowing. And after just 3 days, the plants learned that the direction of the fan blowing indicated the direction the light was going to come. And so they would orient themselves vis-a-vis the direction that the fan was coming. Now, that's learning on non-evolutionary timescales, right? So from the biologist's perspective, even the physicist's perspective, all evolution happens as a result of random genetic mutations that allow certain plants to survive because they're able to sense maybe the fan or something, and other plants to not survive. And over successive generations of reproduction, that the gene mutations that are better adapted for the environment, that survives. But that happens over generational timescales, right, in plants. That's how we think of evolution and learning happening in animals and plants. But what we're seeing here with associative learning is this idea of agency, where you're able to use intelligence based on the information you're getting to, again, remember that the fan means where the light is coming from. And then when you feel the fan and you get sensory information that the fan is blowing, you're able to imagine that that means the light is coming from this direction, even though light isn't really there. So the question is, I think this questions the idea that cognitive agency is only a function of neural pathways.
Can I ask a stupid control question about this that the audience is probably, maybe somebody else wants to know? Did they test it with just the fans and like an overhead light to make sure it wasn't growing towards the direction of like the physical stimuli of the fan?
Yes. She confirmed that the stimulus of the fan was innocuous initially.
Gotcha. I figured. I just had to ask.
Just like the dog, they had no preference either way to the direction of the fan initially. And yeah.
I mean, I think that this speaks to something that I'm always banging on about, which is that we don't have really good models for cognition that doesn't look human. Right? So it's like, even when you go into psychology and you start talking to people that are studying consciousness in other animals, they're kind of like, well, we have the mirror test. And so if you can recognize yourself in the mirror, then that means that you have something that's more akin to human awareness. And I'm like, surely there's some animals that just don't have any ego. And so they see the mirror and they're just kind of like, who cares? And I think that figuring out what these relationships actually look like and the degree to which you can tease out some kind of activity starts to uncover that we're missing a lot of information about what the rest of life actually can do, right? And so we assume that plants can't think because they don't have neural pathways.
Right.
But
we give so much preference to our own way of experiencing reality, right? Like we were hanging out with our friend at Berkeley the other day, who's a linguistics professor. I believe he's in the department. Yeah, he's the chair of the Department of Linguistics, right?
I don't think so.
No, not the chair. Anyways, but he really, really loved the mirror tests, and he was really, really compelled.
He was, and I think that it's understandable because it's a frame that people use and it's recognizable and it's familiar, and everybody's like, well, the mirror test tells us something significant. And we've had conversations with people that are studying neuroscience, and they're like, my cat's probably not conscious the same way that a human is. And I'm like, I don't know that you can really say that. Like, what are we talking about here?
And I think this is the approach that I'm taking. And I think Michael Levin has done tremendous work, not only in the experimental findings that his lab has uncovered, but also in just framing how we ask, how are we defining cognition? It really says we need to take an empirical approach. Just like you said, we can't assume what it's like to be this organism or what inner experience it's having. We need to move away from these parameters around sort of this hard problem and these qualia, right? These ill-defined things. And let's look empirically, and this is my approach. What correlates with thought and memory? What Mike Levin discovered is it's a voltage map. Anatomical memory, when an embryo is developing, all the cells are identical, and then they differentiate by taking on a specific voltage that indicates what organ or tissue it's going to become, right?
So
Same thing with brain waves. What are brain waves? They're voltage changes. So if I'm starting with what we see as thought, we're not saying what consciousness is or what thought is, but what we see and measure as thought is a voltage change in a cell. And so I'm working backwards. What would cause that voltage change in the cell? Because the information of the voltage map for the embryo is not in the DNA. So where could that information come from? That's what I'm proposing, is where that information exists and what's an actual physical mechanism by which it's communicated to cells, right? So where's the voltage information? How do cells get that information? And then that reflects what we see as thought. And we're now able to create a dictionary of sort of your brain. When your brain lights up this way, when these patterns of neurons fire, we know you're thinking this, right? Alexander Huth's work is really interesting with that, where he records people's brain scans, listening to podcasts, creates a dictionary, and then when they're reading something or watching a movie, they can decode just based on the brain scans what the person is thinking, what words what images they're seeing. So we know that those voltage changes really correspond to thinking and then, of course, memory. So the question is, what causes those voltage changes?
And so this is like where the antenna theory of consciousness seems to make a lot of sense, because like there's a lot of conversation right now about whether or not AI is conscious, right? People talk to ChatGPT and ChatGPT gives this feeling of there being a being there because it's able to respond. And I'm like, I think that it is possible to create a machine consciousness, because I think it is possible to create an antenna that's able to integrate information about the world in such a way that it can act on that information. But bodies are important in the sense that they are the integrating mechanism of the entire sensorium. And so it's like, if voltage changes are the readout that we use in order to be able to construct these maps of self and thought and memory and all these other things, then from what we know about the human system, it seems like our senses are the mediating vector for those voltage changes. And so,
yes, I want to distinguish, and this is an important point. We have to distinguish between perception thought and agential thought.
Okay.
So we have these neurological pathways that are sort of on autopilot. Think of that default mode network. Initially, when you're learning an instrument or learning a sport, the executive function of that prefrontal cortex has to really focus on learning this task. But eventually, once those neural pathways are created, they can kind of almost run on autopilot, where you're almost sleepwalking. It's like you're driving and you're not even paying attention. It's on autopilot. And so that is where you have a stimulus, and the pathway is already there, where it's the stimulus that causes the initial voltage change in one neuron that then triggers another one, and then the pathway activates the body to perform in a certain way, right? But where was the voluntary agency to make the choice to embark on learning that task in the first place? What about spontaneous neural firing, where we can't identify a causal change in a neurological pathway that caused that initial? Because if it's all just stimulus response, then I think the physicists view that there is no free will, there is no real agency. What we see as agency is just an apparent pattern in chaos. It's just, again, that Darwinian evolutionary feedback where we're conditioned by our environment, we're responding to the environment, these pathways get created just through this natural selection process, and there's really no true free will, no true agency, no true choice. What I would say with AI is,
Hold on 1 second. Is that really what the physicists think?
oh yeah.
Okay, sorry. I've been living under a rock, I guess.
But yeah, I mean, I think that free will is considered to be this, because when I talk to rationalists and I talk to people that are like super in the programming world, across the board, everybody's like, yeah, free will doesn't exist. It's all deterministic. It's all just atoms bumping into each other. And you basically like, whatever the atoms tell you to do, you're going to do. And
so if they decide to get up out of their chair, it's because that was the only path to the future for them?
I mean, I can't represent this very well because it seems so far from my own.
I have a hard time believing anybody really believes that, but okay.
Oh, they do. Watch Brian Greene, watch, Sabine.
Hossenfelder?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, you can see their commentaries on this subject.
I mean, we're obvious. I want to add, like, we're
logic. Because if you look at quantum field theory, we understand how all the physical particles work, right?
not very physical, but yeah.
We can, let's just talk matter. So fermions and bosons. So fermions are your electrons, your protons, your neutrons, and then the bosons, the photons that govern the electromagnetic force and the forces between these particles, right? We have very accurate equations that predict how those interactions occur. And so whatever patterns we're seeing emerging from that, still fundamentally, those laws are deterministic. I realize you have the sort of quantum randomness, and that's a separate discussion. But even if you do say that there's some quantum randomness involved, that's still random. It's not free will. It's not something that an agent is directing, right? So,
well, you're building that universe from the ground up, right? That's kind of a bizarre way of approaching some aspects of reality, as far as I can tell, right? Because, you know, volcanoes are big composite objects that do weird stuff. And if you're just studying individual atoms, like, you'll never understand a volcano or a hurricane, and far less a being, right?
But there's a difference between non-calculability and if something isn't calculable, that doesn't mean that because it's so chaotic that you can't calculate it because you don't know all of the initial conditions and you don't have enough computing power to calculate it into perpetuity without sort of, or you can't, there's no analytic model that you can use to analyze, to create an equation for the system to tell you, okay, at this time step, this is what the system is going to look like. Those are sort of like numeric modelings where you have to go through, you have to run the calculation. But at the fundamental, at the end of the day, I describe it to others like this. Let's say that God has a bunch of marbles and created the universe in a big bang. Let's just say it just threw out all these marbles, and the marbles are crashing and bumping into walls and each other and all of that. But sometimes there are these swirls that look like a pattern, right? The question is, regardless of how that process started, at each time step, we can calculate based on, we can see a causal change. We can backtrack the causal change. This marble hit that marble and that marble and that marble. The question is, do you have someone blowing on the marbles, deviating their path from time to time? Do you have a consciousness making a choice to perturb the system to be more heads versus more tails, right? Or do you not? And I would say, in terms of physics, there's no entry point by which true agency could come into this deterministic picture. Even if you think of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, where you have these random fluctuations, that's still random. There's no agency in that. In fact, what I'm doing in my model is I'm defining agency as a deviation from those random fluctuations, a deviation in a way that isn't random, but that is agential, meaning that contains information towards a particular outcome. or goal, a deviation that is goal directed.
Don't you think it's kind of a funny assumption that you should be able to back calculate those marbles in some sense? Because, I don't think that any calculating in the world would be able to reassemble an ice cube from a room full of water gas after the ice cube melted. Like, I don't think any amount of information about the trajectory of those particles would put it back in, especially if the ice cube was in the shape of a starfish or something, right? Like, would that
Let's take out quantum jumps, and let's take a look at then the molecular level. Why would you not, if you had a supercomputer and you knew the position of every molecule, and you knew the van der Waals forces, the electrical forces, the photon exchanges from the vacuum, the quantum vacuum, that controls the force, meaning opposite forces attract, like forces repel. If you know the orientations of all those water molecules and the forces between those water molecules, and you take a snapshot of where they are at one point, then why couldn't you then, just through a classical calculation, if you had the computer power, then advance that trajectory just based on classic physics laws?
Yeah, I'm kind of with you on that, in the sense that if you could, like, let's say you have, 10 times, like 1 times 10 to the 23 molecules, but you knew exactly where every molecule was, its momentum, its trajectory, then you could,
I think you would ultimately miss some piece of information about it. Like,
well, hold on. The thought experiment is that you don't miss any information.
Right, but why do we constrain our conception of what's possible in this discipline by a thought experiment that's wholly unrealistic?
Well, hold on a second. I think that there are two aspects to this. One aspect is, I think that consciousness and agency and will and desire and all of these things have to figure into this, because if you have literally just motes of dust and you are capable, let's say you're somehow omnipotent and you're capable of actually looking at all of these things, and you have all of their characteristics, all their physical characteristics, then presumably in this like absolutely ideal thought experiment, you could map them back to where they started. It would be very difficult. It would be almost impossible to have all of the pieces, but theoretically, with enough computational power, with an instrument that's able to measure the momentum and trajectory without changing it somehow in the process, like, there's nothing about a purely physical system that isn't ultimately deterministic.
And if you couldn't, oh, sorry.
But I think that what changes it is that, like, if you have a collision between molecules, there is always the outcome of that collision. Like, if you have trajectory, momentum, physical characteristics, and you slam two marbles together, you know where they're going to go.
That's assuming you know everything about what actually happens when two molecules interact with each other.
So, like, let's say
And my question to you is, if you don't know everything,
Mm.
is what you don't know free will agency? Does that information that you don't know constitute a free will choice or agency? Or is it just the appearance of unpredictability?
It could be, but wouldn't it be easier to just imagine that the atoms have assembled themselves into modules that are capable of making switching choices, and then the modules group together into larger modules that sort of control the switching? And I guess, like, what this comes back down to is, I'm not sure that physics is the appropriate way to reason your way into agency. Like, physics, if it deals only with known trajectories and things like this, is it capable of examining a process that's top down, ultimately?
I think what you're getting at is that the free will is an emergent phenomenon, sort of like analyzing the molecules won't allow you to see what's happening with the flow of the water, that, fluid dynamics is sort of a different discipline. And when you look at dyes in water and you see these very interesting swirls and these interesting unpredictable patterns, you could I guess, think of that as agency and choice, even though fundamentally, where did that agency and choice come in?
Well, okay,
And
so
how are the particles choosing, I guess, is also the question.
I think that if we're talking about agency and choice, I bin this as being emergent from life. Like, I think that if we have a thought experiment, which is ice cube melting in the center of the room and everything eventually evaporates, like, I think that it's possible to, with sufficient computational power, go back to this is the ice cube at the center of the room. But if you have a system that's more complex, like life doesn't just emerge in a room with no gradients. It doesn't emerge in a room with just water molecules. Like you have to have a sufficiently complex system, and there's something about the system that chooses which gradient it's going to follow, that chooses how it's going to interact. Like immediately the mental model that I have is like, okay, so let's say you have two composite objects, two marbles, and they crash into each other and they bounce off just under the laws of physics. You can also have two composite objects that are alive and they crash into each other and they do something different. Like one engulfs the other. Or they do bounce off, or they interact like bacteria do with like pili and exchange genetic information. Like there's a change to what is happening.
Is that what happens at bars late at night?
It is exactly what happens at bars late at night. Like, I think that there's this aspect of life at its most fundamental scale, like the simplest life form that you can imagine, probably even before bacteria. Like, I think that bacteria are the simplest cells. I think that life is a process that probably emerges before bacteria. And so then you come into the place of not being able to reconstruct because you don't have a map for the internal preferences of the life form and what it will choose to do on the basis of the physical forces that are acting upon it. Like, that's the only way that makes sense for me to think about it.
Well, first of all, full disclosure, I agree that there is free will. And I agree with you 100%. But you're making an interesting point. You're talking about life is different. And what I'm addressing is that from the physicist's perspective, they don't know how life is different. Don't have a definition. We don't have a scientific understanding of where conscious agency emerges from. So based on the existing body of scientific knowledge from a physics perspective, the science says that there isn't any conscious agency right now. What I'm proposing is a way that that conscious agency would come in, right? But from physicists' perspective, they don't know where that comes in at this point because of
you're proposing it comes in at all scales too, right? It seems like you're not saying that it's like a scale dependent. Like you're pointing at atomic processes that inject conscious agency.
Yeah, I think I'm going to credit Michael Levin with this, is he's going all the way down the scale to the unicell, the single cell organism, and even down to the molecular level where he's looking at gene regulatory networks that determine what voltage is the cell going to take, sort of once the cell takes on a certain voltage, certain genes get switched on and off. For example, when you have an embryo developing, the eye cells and the stomach cells have the same DNA, but they don't have the same genes that get turned on. They each take a different voltage. Say the eye is 3 volts, the stomach is 6 volts. That triggers different gene regulation because you don't want the gene that creates stomach acid to be turned on in the eye. That would be bad, right? And so the gene regulatory network controls what proteins are created, And
Isn't that largely controlled by like chemical diffusion? Like gradients of different chemicals in what's the thing called, the blastocyst or whatever?
Yes. So once you trigger a chain reaction, then one gene expresses a certain protein that then controls whether another gene is upregulated or downregulated. So that's the network. It's sort of like this chain reaction. But Michael Levin discovered that these gene regulatory networks are also capable of associative learning. So that means that something is happening. There's cognitive agency where they're making choices on non-evolutionary timescales. So it's not all diffusion. It's not all chemistry. That cognition, cognitive agency is now happening at the genetic scale, which are just collections of molecules. So I think if you see consciousness going all the way down to the molecular level, you have to ask yourself, is the material giving rise to the consciousness? Or in my view, is consciousness moving the material pieces? Is it like the Lego analogy where, let's say my child is playing with Legos and my child is invisible, and you're seeing my child build these things, right? And you're thinking, oh, well, because there's so many Legos and they're self-organized like this, that they form because of that into these structures, right? Let's say my child builds a Lego robot, right? And powers it with a battery and it starts moving. And then let's say my child programs that Lego robot to build another Lego robot that then starts moving, right? But the original creation of that original robot, it was sort of like an original free will choice, right? That's the going back to your question, your when you talked about AI. I think the one distinction with AI is that there's always an original program, a goal that's originally programmed, right? And the program may find new ways of achieving that goal, but doesn't create a self-determined goal. Like its primary objective is not necessarily a self-determined one. And so the question is, where does that original free will agency choice to do this come in?
Well, it almost feels like in order to be able to deal with that, to wrestle with that question, we have to go back to the origin of life and the emergence of life, right? Because if you're looking at cells in an embryo, the cells in the embryo are reacting to the directives that have come from the organism that is gestating, or from the fact that the cells are already alive and they're downstream of some other organism that has worked out a program that works well enough to produce eyes that aren't producing stomach acid and a stomach that's full of eyes, right? So it's like, I think that that's what makes understanding this and wrapping our heads around it really complex, because ultimately these questions of how does this come to be have to be asked and answered at the moment that inanimate matter becomes animate. Because the
Yes.
minute that we're trying to deal with it in context of an organism, there's already so many programs that are running where it's like the embryo knows that if it gets this voltage, it needs to produce an eye versus a stomach. And so there is some level of determinism, because absolute free will for that organism would be like, well, I get this voltage and I just do whatever I want. And I'm like, well, that usually doesn't really work out.
Right. You raised two really important points here. This sort of evolutionary, that this voltage map is an evolutionary inheritance, if you will. Question though is, where is it encoded, if not in the DNA? That's one question. The other issue is we see changes to the voltage map on non-evolutionary timescales, for example, and gene regulatory networks. For example, Michael Levin talks about flatworms that are in an aqueous environment. And if you put, I think it's barium in the environment, their heads explode. However, these are regenerative worms, so their head will grow back, I think in a course of a few days. And when it does, it's barium resistant. Now, they've never had any evolutionary exposure to barium, this species. And the number of genetic mutations that would need to be calculated to make the head barium resistance are so complex, you wouldn't expect that to just happen in one generation. This would be where Darwinian evolution would come in, would say, okay, if you have 1 million of these worms in the barium environment, their genes are randomly mutating. Some of them will just happen to stumble upon the right combination that makes their head barium resistant. And then when their head regrows, those few worms are going to be the ones that survive by chance, right? And so it's sort of like this sort of process. But that's not what he's finding, right? He's finding that there is some sort of intelligence, there's some sort of information that is allowing those changes to take place, those adaptations to take place much faster. He talks, there are multiple other examples that he gives, which is causing into question this idea of random genetic mutations are what cause changes in biological systems rather than some sort of intelligent agency. So that's one question, is where does the voltage map come from? And then we're seeing that the voltage map can change, right, on non-evolutionary timescales. And that's what my model is trying to show, a mechanism by which the information, I'm proposing that the information in the voltage map exists in something called the quantum vacuum, which we know is a store of information now.
Pardon the interruption, but if you are enjoying this podcast and you like what we do at DemystifySci, I strongly encourage you to come over to patreon.com/DemystifySci and sign up to give us just 75 cents a week. If you can help support the project, it means that we never have to sell you pills, supplements, powders, grounded mattresses, weird surveillance sleep platforms. We will always be a show that is powered by you, the people who love the ideas, and us, the people who love to explore ideas. So come over to patreon.com/DemystifySci. I'll see you there.
I think any model that we propose for mind should be grounded empirically in empirical evidence. I think there's sort of two broad views. One is that, again, as we've discussed, mind is emergent from networks, cellular networks. And therefore, there's no place for a free will agency to come in, that consciousness is just an emergent phenomenon from the sort of computer processing of our brains. And then there's this other view that mind is somehow separate, this sort of dualism view, that mind is sort of separate and is somehow coming into the physical. And people have presumed, well, maybe there's a field, a consciousness field, or maybe there's a new particle that we haven't discovered that controls thinking. But the issue there is, well, at the end of the day, whatever mind is, it has to interact with the physical matter that we know. If there were this consciousness field, why haven't we detected it? What's the nature of this field? How does it fit into the standard model? How does it interact with the fermions and the bosons that we know about in the standard model? So rather than proposing like a theory of consciousness and imagining that there's this field, I think what I'm proposing is more of a mechanism. Like I said, a mechanism for where mind exists. And I think it's important we define mind. Minds think, or you can say cognition. And I'm defining cognition as agential information processing. So the information processing of an agent that's making free will choices. And so the mechanism that I'm proposing, which is substantiated by sort of empirical evidence, or sort of 4 pillars of this mechanism. But first I'll just lay it out, and then I'll go deeper into the evidence that exists for each part of it. And what I'm suggesting is that mind exists in the quantum vacuum, that it is communicated to cellular antenna via virtual photon fluctuations. And those cellular antenna in turn control voltage gating, the ion channels that control voltage changes within cells. And there is some empirical evidence for sort of all of these stages of the model. One thing I guess the first thing that we can start with is that experiment, that psychokinesis experiment that I mentioned, where people with their mind are influencing a quantum coin flip. So let's think about what that experiment is actually saying. It's saying that with your thoughts, it controls virtual photon fluctuations. What do I mean by that? So basics of quantum field theory says that if all matter were to disappear, every atom in the universe were to disappear, okay? When we say matter, let's just think of electrons, because that's what on the outside of atoms. If all those were to disappear, space would still not be empty. You would have virtual particles popping in and out of existence all the time. So let's just focus on virtual photons, or these virtual particles of light. If you have two electrons, virtual photons are always popping in and out of existence randomly all the time. I like to think of a frying pan with oil that's bubbling. And you can think of those bubbles as these virtual photons popping in and out of existence all the time. If you were to place two electrons in the vicinity of one another, they're going to exchange these virtual photons, and that's going to push them apart. So imagine you're on a boat and I'm on a rowboat, and I'm on a rowboat, and I throw you a bowling ball. It's going to push us apart. So that's us exchanging virtual particles. Virtual photons are what control the electromagnetic force, that electrical repulsion between electrons.
But virtual photons aren't something that we actually observe, right? They're sort of inferred mathematically from this leftover energy between these interactions. Or?
I would question whether it's not a mathematical artifact. It's not like a mathematical trick that's put in to make our equations work. Because if you look at the Casimir effect, right, virtual photons, again, a photon light has a different wavelength depending on its energy, right? A blue ball of light, if you imagine a blue ball of light, its wavelength is going to be very short, okay, high energy, versus a red ball of light is going to have a very long wavelength. If you put two metal plates together, you observe something called the Casimir effect, where because the space between the plates does not allow certain wavelengths of particles, wavelengths of photons to inhabit that small space, right? The longer wavelengths can inhabit that space. So you have virtual photons popping in and out of existence on the outside of the plates, and you have fewer virtual photons able to form between the plates. So you end up with outer pressure on the outside of the plates that pushes the plates together. So we do have actual evidence of the effects of these virtual photons based on the nature of these virtual photons. Quantum field theory wouldn't work if you didn't factor in the contribution of the virtual photons. And those are the bosons. Those are the force mediators that govern the forces between all matter. So they are quite essential, and they are quite real. We have a new field of physics within the past 20 years called relativistic quantum information, where they're probing this vacuum, this space where virtual photons pop in and out of existence. And they're identifying how those photon fluctuations, those virtual photon fluctuations change depending on what physical matter is in the space, depending on whether that matter is accelerating, etc. And so if you go back to that psychokinesis experiment, what are you actually saying? You're saying that with the mind, you have an electron that's being bounced around by these virtual particles randomly, right? Where every now and then a virtual photon with enough energy, say a blue ball of light, gives it enough energy to jump the energy barrier and to tunnel through the barrier. That's what electron tunneling is. But it's completely random because the virtual photons popping in and out of existence, the wavelengths, the colors, it's random. The energy that they have, it's all random. And so you never know when one of those virtual photons is going to pop an electron over the barrier. What we're saying, though, is that with someone's thoughts, with someone's minds, we can change the randomness of those virtual photons. And we can perturb that randomness to push the electron over the barrier sooner or later, right? that somehow thoughts deviate randomness in a way that is goal-directed. So if we take this as a definition of agency, where we're looking at the quantum vacuum, how it's fluctuating, it's completely random. But suddenly, there's a deviation from that randomness towards a goal-directed purpose. That, by definition, could be agency that is factoring into the existing physics that we have. So my proposition is that the mind exists in this quantum vacuum. Do I have anything to back that up? Well, yes, there's this new field of physics called relativistic quantum information. They're probing the quantum vacuum and they're finding a couple of interesting conclusions. One is that the quantum vacuum is a store of information. That information is infinitely entangled. And you can harness that information with a quantum antenna. What is a quantum antenna? Basically, a quantum antenna is a quantum object that has sort of two energy states, where virtual photons can change the energy state of the detector, right? From a ground energy to an excited energy. Think of it like that. What they're finding is if you have these two quantum antenna, these two quantum detectors, let's say they're space-like separated, meaning that they're separated in a way that when they change, they can have no causal effect on one another because they're outside one another's light cones. They're spatially separated in such a way that they cannot communicate to one another via light signals. Nevertheless, you can still entangle these two quantum antenna by harvesting the entanglement of the quantum vacuum. Because the quantum vacuum is infinitely entangled, the antenna can harvest the entanglement from the vacuum to become entangled themselves and obtain information about one another that way. So this is revolutionary because, as I mentioned before when we talked about entanglement, the idea that you can entangle two minds just didn't make any sense because the only way entanglement would occur is if the particles were created locally together and then separated. But now we have an actual experimental protocol in which you can entangle two detectors that are space-like separated through harvesting entanglement in the vacuum. So here we have an experimentally verified mechanism by which you have this quantum vacuum, which is a store of information about every particle in existence, and you can entangle quantum antenna with this quantum vacuum. So that's what I'm proposing, is that mind exists in this quantum vacuum. And it's signaling via virtual photons to cellular quantum antenna. So what would the cellular quantum antenna be? The cellular quantum antenna I'm proposing is the radical pair mechanism, which is a well-studied mechanism. It's what I did my PhD in. It's believed to give birds their magnetic sense. And what the antenna is the radical pair. So you have two atoms where one donates an electron to the other. So they're no longer neutral atoms. They have a charge imbalance. That charge imbalance creates an electron spin imbalance. And those two electron spins can be either parallel or anti-parallel, to simplify. These are two quantum states. So when the radical pair is created, these electron spins are entangled. So you have neutral atoms, one donates an electron, you create electron spins that are entangled and have a binary state, parallel, anti-parallel. Okay. Think of this then, and we know that these radical pairs can control voltage gating, control whether the neuron fires. So you can think of this antenna as getting a signal from the mind in the quantum vacuum saying, fire the neuron, don't fire the neuron. Fire, don't fire. Now,
I'm sorry, I'm smiling because Zoom is just making ridiculous emojis over top of you. So every time you do
it does do that.
So-
It does do that when I do, or balloons or fireworks. I don't know. I don't know how they disable it. Apple tries to be helpful, or Zoom tries to be helpful, and they're just annoying, right?
So I actually discovered that it is an internal mechanism on MacBooks.
See, I knew it was Mac.
Yeah, it's like there's some, like if you look at the taskbar at the top, there's going to be like a little green square, and then like hidden 4 menus deep in that is the options for do you want balloons or not.
Do I want balloons or not? No,
And they're like, everybody wants balloons. How could you want to turn off the balloons? But yeah, it's always fun. This happens a lot when people are especially during like quantum entanglement conversations, because the thumbs up and the thumbs down is the,
right, the spin.
yeah, exactly. But so I think that was a good point to make. But so, okay, so you have this radical pair mechanism where you have atoms that have exchanged their spin information, and these are acting as antennas where if they're both pointed in the same orientation, let's say the voltage gate opens, and if they're pointed in opposite directions, let's say the voltage gate stays closed. Is that kind of a rough approximation?
Yes, that's a good, and it's a simplification, but this radical pair mechanism, this spin chemistry is very well studied. So what causes the exchange of the electron, the radical pair, to be created in the first place? Well, metabolism, something living organisms do that non-living organisms don't do. These radical pairs, these antennae are short-lived. So without the breath, without the continuous process of breathing, these radical pairs wouldn't be created anymore, which is something that living organisms do that non-living organisms don't do. Also, these radical pairs, they've been implicated in how anesthetics work. So anesthetics really select for thinking, that agential consciousness. They don't shut off automatic neurological processes. They really just shut off the perception and the thinking, the processing of perception information. And what was found, now this is theoretical research, but what we find is that anesthetics are isotope dependent, right? So meaning the number of neutrons that you have in the nucleus are going to alter the effectiveness of that anesthetic. So take xenon, for example. Depending on the number of neutrons you have in that atom, it will be more or less effective anesthetic. Turns out you can explain this with a radical pair mechanism. If these radical pair antennas are regulating or somehow at the center of consciousness, then the anesthetic seemed to disable that radical pair mechanism. Again, this flipping, the parallel and anti-parallel. The reason for that is these electron spins, they process about a sort of an inner magnetic field, and the neutrons create an internal nuclear spin environment, right? And so when you mess with that, you're going to mess with the way these spins are processing about that environment, and that's what controls the flipping. So we have a link here where these radical pairs are implicated in regulating consciousness. And it's depending on, again, I said the radical pairs are short-lived. So when the electron jumps back and the two atoms become neutral atoms again, meaning the radical pair lifetime ends, depending on whether the spins were parallel or anti-parallel, that's going to create different products, reaction products in this spin chemistry. And so it's the concentration of those different reaction products that then can control ion gating channels.
Okay, so my first question is about this idea of mind being in the quantum vacuum. I think that the quantum vacuum makes intuitive... So let me take a couple of steps back. I think that the quantum vacuum, in the absence of all atoms, I find that hard to wrap my head around. Like, I think that this is kind of the genesis of the Big Bang in many ways, where, you know, we've talked to lots of people that have kind of quantum consciousness theories, and a lot of it is based on this idea that there's some energetic field that predates the existence of atoms and photons and everything else, and then it's, you know, it's perfectly balanced with matter and antimatter, and then there's some kind of destabilizing flux, and that flux sets off a chain reaction that ends up producing everything. And I'm like, Maybe, but to me, it makes more sense that whatever is in the quantum vacuum is actually the information that's being transmitted between the atoms that exist. Like there's some kind of communication between atoms, and whatever this etheric medium, whether it is, space-time, or it is connections between atoms, or some kind of network, like what we're measuring when we measure the quantum vacuum, to me makes a lot of sense as being the product of these atomic interactions.
I agree with you 100%.
Okay.
100%. And let's keep our focus. I'm not going to go into the nature of mind and the quantum vacuum and what that means, this sort of mystical thing. Let's focus, like you said, on this interaction between atoms. That's key, because the evidence, how do we communicate with the quantum vacuum? What evidence do we have of the quantum vacuum? The only evidence we have is virtual particle fluctuations.
Which
And
themselves seem to be inferred from atomic behaviors at the end of the day. Like you're still reading a voltage at the end of the day that's being, affected.
let's go back to the electron. Let's go back to the vacuum fluctuations in the Casimir effect, right? They're completely random. The virtual photons popping in and out of existence are random unless you disrupt the space. Then the virtual photons are inhibited. You can understand something by breaking it, right? So if the virtual photons are behaving in a certain way, a random way, then if you put a barrier there, does it correspond to your understanding of the nature of those virtual photons? And yes, with the Casimir effect, it does. It means that you can create a space in which some of those virtual photons can exist because their wavelength is too big. And outside.
So my question is, do you have to have virtual photons for that to be the case? Like, because as far as because we had Mike McCullough on, and Mike McCullough is really big on this thing that he calls quantized inertia. And he's trying to figure out propulsion mechanisms that are based on the Casimir effect. And I'm like, is it so if we take that there to be a quantum vacuum where there is information that doesn't rise to the level of photon, like, isn't it reasonable to just, because photons have momentum, right?
I would go one step further and be like, they do. Sorry, are you about to explain maybe you're about to say what I was about to say, sorry.
Maybe. I'm like, there clearly is some kind of momentum exchange that emerges from the quantum vacuum when you go down small enough and far enough, there is motion information that is being transferred between whatever this soup is that everything is in, or this network that everything is in, where the information that's being exchanged is simply like some kind of motion of this substance, and it doesn't rise to the level of photon because photon is a specific organized motion of the substance. And so what we're seeing things that are like below the level of like what photon is, and so we name them virtual photons, but in reality it's just like motion of the vacuum. Is that a fair way to think about it?
Well, I would say a virtual photon is a regular photon. It's just the time in which it exists, and whether it follows the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, meaning the longer it exists, there's this energy time relationship where the bigger the energy it has, the shorter its lifetime. I would say, just broad level speaking, rather than looking at the nature of what the quantum vacuum is, I think it is wise to focus on how the quantum vacuum communicates through virtual particle fluctuations or virtual photon fluctuations. And those virtual photons control the electromagnetic force. When you put an electron and a proton together, that's what causes them to attract, versus when you have two electrons, it's what causes them to separate. So the nature of the virtual photon fluctuations changes depending on what matter is in the space. The matter itself is changing the behavior of those virtual photons fluctuations. So
There's kind of a problem though, because like I understand that like fundamentally electrons are defined as matter, but they're not really material is the thing, right? They have like what I think Nastia was pointing at was the intrinsic momentum of these particles, right? And so it turns out that particles aren't really little pieces of goop necessarily.
So let's define that. So every particle can be modeled as a field, right? And so the quantum vacuum is just when there is no particle present. It's sort of like the zero energy state of that particular field. So you have an electron field, you have a proton field, you have a neutron field, you have a photon field, gluon field. All the standard model particles are a field. When you have
which is sort of like a zone of influence.
when you have a localized change in the energy of that field, you're no longer in the quantum vacuum. Just means the zero energy, the ground state. When you have a localized increase in the energy of that field, that is a particle. That's what we define as a particle. If that localized energy increase is persistent, then we call that matter, right? Those are the particles that sort of stay around, that form the atoms that have persisted since maybe the forming of the planet, if you will, or from the stars that created, right? These are the persistent particles. So we call that matter. How do we distinguish that from virtual particles? They're the same. It's just a energy fluctuation of the same fields. So you have virtual electrons, virtual protons, virtual neutrons.
Yeah,
And
I think like the confusion
it's the time that they exist. That's the only difference.
I get that 100%. I think what I'm pointing at is just that a field is an abstraction to begin with. It's like a region with some vector that varies with time or distance, right? And so you just the reason that this gets really confusing is because we don't have a material model for what is actually the substrate giving rise to the field. Like we don't have a picture of what bodies, let's say, whatever tiny little subunits are acting out the dance that we capture in the concept of a field. And so therefore we're kind of starting with this map of some activity without actors fundamentally that we have plugged into the story. So it kind of starts in media res with these actions, right? The field represents some action, right? A predictable action.
Represents information, because if you think of a photon field, what is it? It's a condition of space. It says that if I put a proton, and let's leave aside the fact that the proton itself is an information field, but let's say if I put a proton at this point in space, the electromagnetic field just tells me what force it will feel and what direction, how strong that force will be and what direction it will be. So the electromagnetic field itself, there's no substance to it. It's just an information field that tells you, it's an information on the condition of space.
But I guess what I'm saying is I think that's kind of a disaster. Like, I think it's kind of a disaster that you start with you start with all these activities, right? The field not being physical, but being reflective of some underlying physical process. This makes a really confusing situation.
Well, let me address that though, and say that I think there are two separate questions. I think there's another question that could be asked of, well, what are these fields really, right? Do we really understand? We can model these fields mathematically, but is there some deeper physicality to them that we're not grasping? That's a valid question. However, our mathematical models do allow us to predict the outcome of experiments. It allows us to manipulate the physicality around us in very successful ways. So, given what we do know about the nature of our reality, I'm addressing a small question, which is, when we measure the fluctuations of this quantum vacuum, can we detect deviations from randomness that would explain the psychokinesis experiment? That would because the electron, no matter what the electron is, we measure how the electron is behaving due to virtual photon fluctuations. That it's just what we observe, it's what we measure, right? Everything that we see, it's because photons are hitting the retina in our eyes and causing those electrons to move. So everything we experience are virtual photons moving electrons. That's the nature of our experience. And rather than addressing the question of, well, what are those photons and what are those electrons and what is their true nature? I'm not addressing that. I'm saying what we know about the interactions of photons and electrons. Is there a deviation from our calculated equations that if we measured that deviation, that by definition is agency? That by definition is new information coming in that our equations are not calculating. I'm pointing to the psychokinesis experiments as evidence that that is happening. The equations of quantum field theory will predict the probability distribution that an electron will tunnel based on the randomness of virtual photons. And so any deviation from that probability distribution in a specific goal-oriented direction constitutes new information coming into the system. And so that's my only question that I'm pinpointing, is I'm saying, I think that there is new information coming into virtual particle fluctuations, that they're not always random, and that somehow thoughts, when we experience thought and we have the intention to nudge the electron through the energy barrier sooner, that somehow our conscious thought is able to nudge those virtual photon fluctuations to push the electron towards that goal rather than not.
So, if I understand virtual photons correctly, it's basically this mechanism that stands in to explain how okay. Particles is a really tricky thing because particles they're not objects, right?
Not physical
They're not
objects.
physical objects. They're some kind of
Informational objects that persist over time.
yes. Okay, agreed.
100%.
100%. And so there's basically some kind of fluctuation, right?
In the virtual objects, not the
But in
not the physical objects that's permanent. So let's say electron and photon, just to distinguish, where the photon is a temporary fluctuation, whereas a temporary energy fluctuation, where the electron is a persistent, localized energy
Okay.
element.
And so basically there's this question of, how is it that the electron shell of one atom can affect the electron shell of another atom without them touching? And so the virtual photon it's kind of like the force carrier for these interactions. Is that a fair model?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
So I think that it's reasonable to start to ask the question of like, okay, there is, and it's reasonable to ask the question of how is that momentum transferred? How is this information shifted? And can minds in general affect the transfer of that information? Because it seems like there are experiments that demonstrate that it's possible. And I think that seeking to explain those results with some kind of underlying mechanism, right? Like there is information exchange. The mind appears to affect that information. How is that happening? All of these things are like super deep and interesting questions. I am annoyingly materialistic when it comes to physics.
Mechanism?
Yeah, mechanistic maybe. I'm like always trying to construct a mental model in my mind. Like as we're talking about virtual photons, like I have a picture in my mind of, two atoms, and the atoms they have some kind of laminar flow on their surfaces that I model charge as, right? So it's like
Might be a good time to talk about the radial distribution function of the electron.
Well, I would ask for a physical model that's less Copenhagen and more pilot wave. And I think, where the electron is not a probabilistic smear of location of charge around the atom, but has a definite position at any one point in time. And the reason that position moves in apparently random ways is because the electron is being guided by a pilot wave.
So I think that that's
And the pilot wave is there's research suggesting the pilot wave is the virtual photon fluctuations, which is interesting since relativistic quantum information has found that the vacuum is this infinitely entangled structure, which was predicted of the pilot wave. It's sort of like a requirement of the pilot wave. So I think there's some evidence coming out that supports this pilot wave view where matter is, you don't have wave particle duality. Matter is matter. But those virtual fluctuations, think of the virtual photons as like waves coming and going in an ocean. And then the electron is a beach ball on top of the ocean. Sort of, it looks like the beach ball is moving around randomly, but it's really just these waves that kind of knocking it around.
interesting. So
That's that oil droplet model where you have this underlying vibration. And the underlying vibration in those oil droplet models is information, right? Because it's a frequency or a combination of frequencies, right?
yeah, absolutely.
And I'm saying that's what the information of mind is that frequency and the change in that frequency. So that's what's controlling the virtual photon fluctuations and and so in quantum field theory, we can model those virtual photon fluctuations. They're random, and I'm just suggesting any deviation from that random in an agential way is how new information is coming in.
And I think that the reason that the question of like, what is the quantum vacuum is a valuable question is because it allows for a mechanistic model by which a mind that is separated from the detector is able to somehow influence intervening space, right? Because I'm like, the principle that it's possible seems apparent. Like, obviously minds are affecting things. Like, that's a starting point that I think is perhaps outside the Overton window of what you can say, at like APS or something. But I think that plenty of people outside of the super hardcore physics community that are actually like thinking about minds and thinking about reality and the ability to change reality by thinking about it are on that tick. So I'm like, okay, let's assume that as background. And I think that your intuition about the fact that there is this agency that is injected into the system is really fascinating because it like Levin's work seems to feed to it that there's some kind of agency in the body of the worm that is able to influence what it will do downstream in this kind of field effect sort of way, which doesn't come back to genetics, and it breaks evolutionary theory in some way because like the worm shouldn't be able to learn how to do that, and the fact that it knows how to do that is pretty freaking weird. And I think that for me to be able to like slot this into my model of the world, it's like, okay, I think that pilot wave theory and the hydrodynamic quantum analogs are enlightening in the sense that they tell us that there is some substance that is moving in some way that results in this like pilot wave phenomenon. And so for me, like I see, like Shiloh was mentioning the radial distribution function of the atom, and I want to try this out on you, where it's like, if you look at the distribution of an electron around a nucleus, like most of it, like 99.99% is within 430 picometers of the nucleus.
For hydrogen.
For hydrogen. But
shell.
and it's like, right? It's like, like all of these things are developed in such a relatively narrow window that you do have to put all of these caveats on it, where you're like, okay, in this like very specific frame, we have this information. But in the hydrogen S shell, the electron distribution is largely around the nucleus, but it also goes off to infinity. And I'm like, that infinity seems to be the fabric of this vacuum.
Because we treat that electron distribution as the surface of the atom, like at least the chemists do, right? We were talking about the electron being the surface of the atom. And so if the surface extends indefinitely, at least in some rarefied portion, then you actually can conceive of some sort of furry atom that's actually in contact with its neighbors and perhaps even distant neighbors as well. Like you don't have to necessarily be limited to the information space if you have a physical atom that has extended structure to it.
Well, it's not that you're
If
limited or
this
not
is-
limited to the information space. I think that it's more that if there is actually a network of connection between atoms, then that is where the information is stored and how it is transmitted, right? Because like I think that the like you said, like the mathematics of quantum physics are really good. They're very predictive. They're able to tell you at what likelihood you will find the
Right.
electron on the other
Let
side of the
me-
barrier.
I like that when you're talking about the infinitesimal distribution of the electron cloud around the atom. And so let's take that. Let's take the Copenhagen interpretation. How do we model what we're going to see when we put two electrons in a space? Just two electrons, not atoms. They're going to repel. How do they repel? Through the exchange of virtual photons. Like I said, us on boats throwing balls back and forth. We separate. Okay. That said, it's not that one. How do we actually model that behavior? It's a distribution. It's a sum of all the possible interactions that could occur of virtual particles between those electrons. So maybe one electron exchanges a proton. One electron exchanges a photon with the other. But maybe the photon exchange, also the photon separates into two different particles and then recombines back into a photon, right? And you take all the possible interactions, virtual particle interactions, the more complicated the interaction, the less weight it has. And so you end up with this long equation that's a sum of all these Feynman diagrams, all these possible interactions. It's a weighted sum. And so, yes, there's this infinitesimal probability that you have of a rare interaction, but it's there. And if you don't include it, then you don't get the right prediction. If you don't take a weighted average, if you only assume that, nope, it's only the exchange of a proton, that's what separates the electrons. So you do have this sort of weighted average. That is really a mathematical, again, just as you said, that's a mathematical model that we use to model the probability we're going to get of where an electron is in that atom. We're able to determine what those probability distributions are of where it's most likely going to be found when we measure it. And it's sort of like modeling the wave function. That wave function is like that weighted average of all possible locations. That's really the Copenhagen interpretation, where you're modeling the electron with the wave function, right? Where the position of the electron is modeled as a wave function, where you have this sort of wave particle duality, where the electron has this wave nature, and then when you measure it, the wave function collapses into a definitive location. But if you take the Bohmian mechanics interpretation, where the electron has a definitive position around the atom at any point in time, what's causing that to randomly move is the pilot wave, which again is suggested to be the virtual the virtual photons themselves, where the quantum vacuum itself is the pilot wave. The bubbling quantum vacuum is the pilot wave, and the wave function then is attributed to the universal quantum vacuum and those quantum vacuum fluctuations. That's your wave and your C. That's nudging and moving around the electron. And so we're really saying the same thing. I'm saying, and now we have experimental evidence that that quantum vacuum, that wave, is entangled, because whenever one particle changes its state, that information is updated in the quantum vacuum throughout the entire universe instantaneously. So that's where the entanglement is within the quantum vacuum, which is why I think the Bohmian model was rejected, because entanglement conflicts with relativity. And in the Copenhagen interpretation, it's easier to isolate entanglement to two particles that are created locally together versus having to deal with entanglement throughout the entire universe. But if you have any non-local aspect to consciousness that you're trying to explain, then you need that non-locality, you need that entanglement. So I think we're saying the same thing. Either you have two atoms where the wave function of the electron is smeared out into infinity, and therefore those atoms are having contact with one another. That's a Copenhagen interpretation view. Or you say that no, the electrons or the atoms are point objects, they're isolated, but they're connected through, we make the wave function the pilot wave that's moving them and governing their forces between them. And we say that that's where the entanglement exists. It's almost like kind of the same concept, just modeled mathematically in two different ways. And Bohmian mechanics is mathematically identical to the Copenhagen mechanics. They're two equivalent formalisms that will predict quantum experiments equivalently.
Yeah, and I think I think we are saying the same thing, because I think that what we're trying to get at is the fact that, look, where does the agency come from? Is it defined by the system that informs the shape of those interactions? The pilot wave, or whatever, or the virtual photons, or whatever it is, whatever name that is that you want to give to it.
The activity of the vacuum?
Yeah, the activity
among the whatever materials are operating in the vacuum?
Right, because I'm like, okay, I like to play with this idea of like a single atom universe. Can you have a photon in a single atom universe?
Yeah, if you have a single atom, we're going to say that that's the matter, that's the stable matter. And let's take a hydrogen atom. So our atom is a proton and an electron. Does that seem fair, rather than helium where you have a neutron? So keep it simple. So we have a single proton and an electron that sort of orbits it. And those are stable matter objects. Let's say they've existed for, billions and billions of years. We're still going to have, and let's say our standard model only has three particles, electrons, protons, and photons, right? Because what holds that atom together, the electron and the proton? What holds them, the electron in orbit around that proton? It's the electromagnetic force, right? Which is mediated by virtual photons. So you need the photon, that's the force carrier for your electromagnetic force that holds that atom together. So it's the exchange of those virtual photons that's keeping that atom intact. Yeah, those virtual photons are popping in and out of existence all the time. And the virtual photons, depending on the longer they exist, the less energy they have, right? And so think of virtual photons as balls of light. That's how I describe them to people, because a photon is a ball of light. And think of different colors. So, a blue ball of light has more energy, and so it's going to last a shorter amount of time than a red ball of light, which has less energy, so it can live longer. So yeah, you have these different wavelengths of light popping in and out of existence constantly all the time. If there's no atom in the space, if we're in a region of the universe where that atom is not there, then those virtual photons are going to be popping in and out of existence all the time randomly. A green, a blue, a red, for varying amounts of time, according to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. But once that atom is in the vicinity of that atom, the nature of those vacuum fluctuations changes to hold that atom together, right? Because now you have the electron and the proton exchanging those virtual photons in a way that keeps them together. Now, because this is attraction, you can think of us on the boats and we're firing boomerangs. Our backs are to one another and we're shooting boomerangs, right? And those boomerangs come back and draw us together, right? If we both fling off a boomerang and we catch it, it brings our boats together, right? So that's how the exchange of virtual photons between us creates that attractive force to hold us together. So that's the model to explain how we see subatomic particles behaving.
Okay. And so in that single atom universe, where, like, let's say you have the single atom, this is like a totally crazy thought experiment, single atom universe, and then you have a mind that now begins to influence it. In the single atom universe, how do you see the influence of the mind playing out? Like,
Well, there is.
I obviously, like, you have to have atoms. Do you have to have atoms in order to have mind, in your opinion?
No, and I think that's what I'm suggesting a mechanism by which the afterlife could occur. I'm suggesting a mechanism by which, if you don't have a physical body receiving the broadcast of mind, that doesn't mean that the mind cognition doesn't stop.
Mm.
The information processing of that mind and the ability of that mind to have agency and goals doesn't stop. It may not be effectuating any matter because it's not controlling any matter anymore. But I work with mediums. I study a lot of the research on mediums, and I look at a lot of the anecdotal evidence of these readings that mediums give and the communications that they seem to be having with discarnate minds. And I use that as sort of a pointer. If that is true, could my model explain that? And I think it does. This idea that these discarnate minds still seem to be perceiving things that have happened after they've died, and they still seem to be commenting on those things, and they still seem to have preferences about those things. So I'm proposing that, yeah, the mind is still engaged in this agential cognition, even though it's not communicating that information to any sort of matter or moving any kind of matter. But back to your one atom a model, how agency would come in, let's say that this free will agent, we know we can have ionization, right? And there's a certain probability that that attraction will dislodge, that the electron, again, its energy flux, it's sort of like it's in an energy barrier, like electron tunneling. It's trapped in an energy barrier of attraction with this proton. But there's a non-zero chance that it could ionize and it could dislodge from that through, again, the virtual photon exchange. So could a mind will that to happen? Could a mind perturb those virtual photon fluctuations enough to nudge them in a goal-oriented direction to give the electron enough energy to ionize? That would be an example where if we modeled the behavior of the atom according to the quantum field theory, and we took a weighted average of all the probabilities of where that electron is going to be, right? The chances of it ionizing are super small, right? If we see, though, that a mind is able to skew our calculations, where the atom no longer is following that probability distribution, where let's say you try this many times with many of your single atoms, right? If you modeled that, there would be a non-zero chance that the electron would ionize. But then if you do another series of experiments, millions and millions of tests, where now you have a mind that is causing it to ionize more frequently than you would have if there were no mind present, then that would be evidence that thought somehow can perturb the behavior of virtual photon fluctuations that are controlling the interaction of this electron and this proton.
Why do you think that it couldn't just be directly controlling the electron? Like, why do you think that it couldn't just be like a direct peer-to-peer transmission?
I'm not saying that couldn't be, but I don't know of any mechanism in physics. The only thing that causes the electron to move that we know of right now are virtual photons. So you could say then that There's some other force that we've not yet measured that's acting on the electron, but the only force that we know of that interacts with the electron is the electromagnetic force or the photon field. So all of our fields in the standard model, there are some fields that don't interact with other fields, right? Like neutrinos don't interact with matter, and and so we know how these fields interact. There's the Pauli exclusion principle. We know that two electrons can't hold the same space. Those are fermions. But we know with bosons, that's not true. The photons, they can occupy the same space, and then they become a superposition. So if you want to propose a new sort of force acting on a particle, the question then is, well, why haven't we seen that force before?
So then my question is, how do you have a mechanism by which disembodied mind is able to affect the condition of an atom? So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that there is the electromagnetic field that is producing these virtual photons. The virtual photons are producing the pilot wave that governs the position of the electron, and then you have this disembodied mind that's affecting the position or affecting the wave function or whatever it is that you want to call it. Is there a mechanistic way that that's able to happen if it's truly disembodied in the sense of not existing as a product of atoms?
Well, so a couple of things. I think it's important to say that in terms of how subatomic particles interact with one another, that's well-known physics. So I'm not proposing anything new there. What I'm proposing is that that thoughts, which we don't really know what thoughts are. I'm not really going into what consciousness is in this quantum vacuum or anything like that. What I'm saying, what we observe a thought to be, is a perturbation, again, a goal-directed deviation from the probability distribution that we would expect in terms of the interaction of the virtual particles and these matter particles, so photons and electrons. So in terms of a discarnate mind, well, let's talk about an incarnate mind. What do I think is happening first? Because when it comes to a discarnate mind, it's really a communication between two minds. One that, I'm saying both minds, the medium and the spirit, if you will, the discarnate mind. Both those minds are in the quantum vacuum. And so if the quantum vacuum is an infinitely entangled structure, there can be an intentional information exchange between those two minds. What's really happening, though, is the medium, or all of us, I'm saying our minds exist in the vacuum, and we're signaling our thoughts and our communications to those quantum antennae in our cells to then govern the voltage changes in cells that then control the physical apparatus, our physical apparatus. What I'm proposing is that the brain and the body is a focusing mechanism where we've made the agential decision, sort of inhabiting a body is an agential decision to focus only on the sensory information being filtered through the body and the brain. That we're only going to focus on that information, okay? If the body, that focusing mechanism, were to die, suddenly we would be able to perceive more information than what's being funneled through that body. And I think that's what mediums or out-of-body experiences sort of are. It's a temporary disruption in the soul focusing of information coming through the body. And I'll give an example, an analogy. I don't know if you've seen the rubber hand experiment, the fake rubber hand experiment, right? Where very quickly, if you are receiving sensory information and you're focusing solely on that fake rubber hand, you very quickly begin to believe that that is you. You have the sensation that this is me. This is my body. I'm only focused on the sensory information that is coming in through this body. So much so that if you threaten it with a knife, the person actually has a visceral jumping reaction. I would describe my out-of-body experience like that, where say that there's a break, there's a momentary break in the stimulus where you realize, oh, wait, no, I'm not that fake arm. I'm waking up to perceiving that, no, I have other sensory information coming in. But I think the body is somehow a focusing mechanism for the mind that's in the vacuum. It is choosing for whatever reason and whatever, I don't know what that tethering mechanism is, but that agent, show mind, is choosing to focus only on sensory information that's coming in and filtering through this body. But it has the capacity, if it dissociates from the body, to perceive other information. And that's what a lot of the psychics tell me. One of the keys for them is merging their identity with the object that they're trying to get information on. And this also correlates with the psychokinesis experiment, where what did he do? He inhibited, and I have the region for you, the left medial middle frontal region, Brodmann areas 9, 10, 32. That is the area that holds that sense of identity, that holds that sense of boundary of what is me and what is external environment. When you disrupt that or you lower that, you're able to, perhaps the mind is able to exert that thought control, not just on the quantum antenna in the cells, but perhaps on the electron that's being tunneled, right? There's sort of a merging between the body system and this electron tunneling system, where my sense of what I am, because I'm also now focused on that electron in the tunnel, that I can then influence it, because now I'm focusing on it like it's the rubber hand. And that's what psychics often say, is they have the ability, they have a loose sense of boundaries of self, and they're able to somehow, this is how they describe it, that they're able to sort of form their identity with other systems to get information about those other systems.
And that seems to imply the importance of embodiment, right? Where it's like there is information of some kind that is in the network, whether that's some remnant of mind or some sort of perturbation of the quantum vacuum that's associated with somebody's life. And the only way that it's able to be transmuted into some kind of some kind of effect, some kind of mechanism, has to be filtered through a body. And so if we go back to this like single atom universe, I imagine that you have to have some kind of embodiment of like if the mind exists, or if the mind is information encoded in the vacuum, until that information is somehow put through a system that's able to focus it and then exert this is going to sound real woo,
Agency.
but exert the will of that agency, it's lost, like it's not able to transmute into something. And so I think that this in some ways seems like the core of life, which is like, why does it emerge in the first place? It seems insane that you would have atoms that come together to harvest energy flows at gradients inside the earth that then emerges to produce everything from like dolphins to Van Gogh. And it seems it's almost it's almost a spiritual question, right? Like why does life? And I think that if there is something that is some kind of information that is in this network, and that information has the desire to be able to exert its agency, it must make bodies that have function in order to be able to do things. And it seems plausible that the bodies can then like kind of push back on the information a little bit in order to shift it. Because it's like, it's worth noting that whatever effects people are seeing are statistically significant, but they're not like levitation. People aren't ionizing things with their minds. It's
That's
these
important.
like
Yeah, it's
delicate
important.
things.
That's why the radical pair mechanism is important, because it's a temporary creation of a very sensitive antenna, right? Because I'm not saying with your mind you can move mountains, right? That you're moving matter in major ways. we're talking about perturbing a quantum fluctuation of a system that's very sensitive to quantum fluctuations.
And
Right.
I think that something that we're always on about is the lack of like agency in evolutionary theory. Because,
Mm.
right, you have to look at the world and you're like, well, why are there humans and why are there ants and why are there bees and wasps and all kinds of flowers and trees? And it's a little bit weird if agency isn't included in it because
Which is ironic because Darwin does mention this will to survive as often as he does the natural selection capacities and so forth. But it totally gets left out of the intro biology courses.
but I like my most woo feeling about this is not that it's just the will to survive, but it's like a will to
Explore?
style and preference. Where I'm like, I think that humans evolved from a common ancestor with with their like chimp cousins, not just by virtue of like who was more successful at building tools. Like I think that humans like to do certain things. And that there's no explanation possible in a world of atoms just slamming into each other where you end up with a kind of primate that likes to live in buildings and talk on Zoom versus one that likes to live in the forests and eat fruits.
Each other?
Yeah. Right? And so I'm like,
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And I think the first step is proposing a mechanism, a physical mechanism based on the physics we actually have, not inventing new physics or new science, right? But proposing a mechanism by which that agency can come in to then begin to have a conversation of, well, then why? What does, how and, why is it looking the way that it looks, right? I think sort of what my contribution is to sort of shake maybe up the scientific community and saying, no, it's not a foregone conclusion that life is just a pattern in determinism. And look, here is a possible mechanism by which agency could come in. And it's not silly to then have the conversation of, well, okay, well, then now we know agency can come in. Why does it come in? Why does it come in this way? Those questions aren't mute. I think a lot of physicists will say, oh, well, that's just nonsense. That's just, what do you mean the why, the will to survive? There is none of that. Well, no, like my small contribution is sort of validating these questions and sort of dismissing the physicists who want to say that there's no free will. The physics tells us that there's no way agency could come in, so that we can then move past that to then ask, okay, all I'm talking about is the mechanism by which free will could come in. But then again, you're getting into, again, the bigger question, which we all are really getting at, is why? Why does it look like this? And what is the nature of our free will? And I personally agree with you 100% that I think it is this question of exploration, right? I mean, that's what sort of these discarnate minds are telling us, that they can't effectuate matter, they can't create. But we are on the edge of creation. We are the creators. I mean, now we're getting almost biblical, where man is created in God's image, and what is God's primary purpose? Creation, and that we are in some aspect creating this project of life and life's evolution together. And through our experiences, forming preferences, trying something and saying, no, let's try it a different way. No, I want to have a new experience. That's something that I personally believe in.
I mean, for me, from this very physical perspective, it seems evident empirically that groups of atoms can come together and express their will. Like, this is what's happening in this room right now with all of us, right? Like, this is known that groups of atoms can do this. And so whatever substructure the material reality of the vacuum is comprised of, I see no reason to doubt that similar processes could occur at that scale, right? It would be unreasonable to observe all of these atoms doing what they want in these composite beings, right? And then to assume that at some other scale, whatever fibers are constructing the atom and its interconnections and the vacuum space, it would be unreasonable to assume that it's at least that it's not possible such a thing could be occurring at a different scale. And likewise, I would extend that upward in scale as well. It's a little bit unreasonable to look up at, the night sky and say that it's completely impossible that these large-scale structures could be organizing themselves in some conscious process. Because we know that that's an aspect of our everyday universe, right? That's just the reality. As much as it's not a fun billiard ball system and it's obnoxious computationally, it does seem to be a feature of reality. And so I can completely get behind the idea that it's very likely that whatever's in that vacuum space is the same subunits that construct our atoms, and the atoms themselves are acting out this play. Yeah, it doesn't seem unreasonable from a first principles perspective that some sort of cognitive processes could be acted out at that scale, and that they should, in some sense, influence the atomic scale structures as well.
This immediately makes me think. So, Shiloh and I don't really fight that much, but there is one fight that we've had for ages, which is about whether or not life is eternal. If you take, let's say the Big Bang didn't happen, because we're actually organizing a conference in Portugal about the Big Bang, and plenty of people that are eternal steady state universers are coming. So I'm like, okay, let's say that it's possible that the Big Bang didn't happen. Is there a moment that life emerges, or is it the same way? Is it the same kind of question as asking, when did a hurricane emerge for the first time? And it's it might just be a pattern that atoms take. And in its most simple form, it's something that doesn't look like you or me. And yet, over time, under sufficiently stable conditions, can evolve towards something that has progressively more and more and more and more agency. And so if you look at it that way, then you suddenly remove a lot of these weird dualistic questions of how does life come from inanimate matter? Where does agency emerge? What is the first process of forming the first star? And it's well, if it's always been, and it's just this process of flow and change and organization, you don't have to ask the question of where does consciousness emerge? It's well, it's there. It's an aspect of the universe as much as atoms are. And our task is to figure out how to map it together into something that makes sense.
That's exactly what I'm proposing. Exactly what you said. And I think this is what differs from, I'd say, orchestrated objective reduction, which is Stuart Hameroff and Sir Roger Penrose's model of quantum consciousness. So my model is obviously a quantum model of consciousness. Theirs is as well. But they imagine that there's this primordial consciousness, that when the wave function collapses, that's a conscious event. It's sort of like the energy of life. But that the actual thinking and cognition is happening as a quantum computation between these sort of molecular structures that are qubits. And they're in a superposition, and when they collapse, that's when consciousness emerges. So in their view, they're thinking that they're trying to explain, okay, if these microtubules that they say are these calculating qubits exist in the brain, but they also exist in your liver. Why is the brain the source of our thoughts and not our liver? They're trying to explain that to say, well, the brain molecular structures are computing, they're thinking, they're cogniting. It's a quantum computation. And in their model, consciousness, this primordial consciousness has less information than the quantum computation creates. I'm saying the opposite. Back to your point, I'm saying that the full information of the agent exists, and I'm saying that less information is reflected in the neuronal activity than exists within the agent itself, right? I'm saying that the mind in the quantum vacuum is probably undergoing more cognitive thought, more information than what is being signaled to voltage changes that we're seeing, meaning that the experience that I'm having of emotion and thought and the profoundness of my inner world and experience, all that information is probably more than what is necessarily being reflected in those voltage changes or necessarily being signaled at one time. I think of it as my child, right? He has all these Legos and he wants to build something fabulous. But at first he just starts putting a couple of Legos together in a certain way. And that didn't work out so well. Let's try this way and that way. And it's this evolution on the physical level. But the agent has way more intention than what we're seeing manifest in the physical forms that the agent is building at any one point in time. But the complexity of those physical forms is going to continue to increase to get closer and closer to the vision or the information or the intention that that agent, that mind has.
Sounds like we've reinvented God. Well, and thank God for that, I suppose, ultimately.
I love that.
I think that it's a really interesting question because we're always banging on about the fact that physics can only explain some portion of the world. And if we seed all of our sciences, our entire tree of knowledge, to a foundation of just things bumping into each other and the elasticity or inelasticity of those collisions as being what the universe is built out of, and the only thing that governs its actions, I think that we will never actually get to significance and meaning and these larger, bigger questions about spirit. And
What is this place? What are we doing here?
yeah.
Why is there something rather than nothing?
And it's like, we're not really allowed to talk about spirit in the sciences. It's kind of a forbidden language. And I think that I can understand in part why that happened, because there was this need to differentiate from religion, and there was a sense that if you can't explain it just by virtue of mechanics, then it's not really a real thing. And I get the feeling that it's a passing fad. Like, there's never been a time in human history where we have ablated spirit so completely as we have over the course of the last, let's say, 70 years.
And why do so many people then distrust science when it seems to conflict with your own personal, intuitive sense of life? Oh, you think you have free will, but you really don't. Oh, that out-of-body experience you had, oh no, that was just an illusion. You know, oh no, all the spiritual gurus, teachers, the information that they seem to be getting that seems to sort of unify all world religions and spirit. There are these unifying ideas. Oh no, that's just coincidence. And so I think people then naturally question science. And I think that's a communication problem. I think science should be more clear that this is what science can explain and can't explain right now. This is what science can say about reality now. This is what we can calculate. This is what we can manipulate, which is really what science is. Once we understand the physical system, we manipulate it in some way, in a predictable way, right? But we can't then say that what science can explain can't be real. And I think the step I'm hoping to take with this theory is to open the door and to say, okay, let's no longer have that definitive statement that minds cannot be entangled, that there's no physical mechanism by that which that can happen. I'm not saying the physical mechanism I'm proposing is the way that it does happen, but I'm for the first time at least showing a physical mechanism by which it could happen, by which an afterlife could be real, by which psychic phenomena could be real, so that we can stop this definitive statement that there is no physical mechanism by which that could happen. And then we can open the door, I think, to the conversation and further research into this area and validate that research.
I think it's a really cool project, and I think that we come at it from I think that Charlotte and I tend to be real completists about things. And so the thing that we're attempting to do is we're trying to figure out how to make the current zoo of quantum physics interpretations have some kind of mechanistic material interpretation. So when we're talking about like electrons and photons and virtual particles and the zoo of the standard model and fields, we're like,
Force carriers and
right? And so we're basically like, I think that there's something there. I think that there's a there, and we're trying to figure out some physical structure that you can put into your mind. So instead of just having mathematical equations, which work for a lot of people, like, you know, you look at Richard Feynman and the way that he talked about math, and he's like, I can see the equations. Like he would talk about the fact that he could like color code them, and they existed in his mind as real devices.
Right.
And I'm like, most people aren't like that. And so when you tell them, and which is why I think people are so lost when it comes to quantum, and there's so much stuff that is based on kind of radical interpretations of what quantum physics is saying, and there's no real agreement. Like, you go and you ask a team of particle physicists, like, what is a particle? They can't agree on it. There's not a unified definition of what a particle is. And so I'm like, okay, well, I think that the future of science requires us to have some kind of foundation for all of physics that people can more or less agree about the various pieces and how they fit together. Because if somebody comes with a theory of mind and agency that emerges from some kind of interaction with like the quantum vacuum, understanding how that works probably requires most people to be on the same page about like, okay, well, this is what we're talking about.
and what I was trying to say earlier about that too is just that it's kind of like mathematical physics is kind of like accounting. Like, you have all these spreadsheets and you can put together equations that govern how these different economies interact with one another. But at the end of the day, like, there's people doing work, doing processes, generating products, exchanging them, labor. Like, there's all of this really fine-grained, like almost irreducibly complex physical processes at play. And you can still accurately model them using these accounting equations and so forth. But at the end of the day, there's still some physical substrate acting out all of these processes. And so it seems to me like the final frontier with a lot of these things is honing in on the physical processes that, like, what is a photon? What is an electron? Like, what does it mean to have this, like, what is the field actually pointing at? What are the subunits that are acting out this dance? Like, that's how we'll get close to actually making a model that people can behold by and large without having to be accountants, essentially. Although it works great for engineering, I completely understand.
Right. And I think it's important to say that, you know, quantum physics, at least the Copenhagen interpretation, that's all it's saying. It's saying if I start with this state, I have a set of weighted averages that will predict what I'm most likely to see at a future state. It's just accounting, just like you said. I think the field of relativistic quantum information that's only developed in the past 2 decades, I think it's exploring this question more and coming up with more answers that, in my view, seem to support the Bohmian mechanics view of what is physically actually happening, right? It's giving us more of an intuitive sense. Even Roger Penrose said that the pilot wave theory is probably more physically where you're able to wrap your head around what physically could be going on.
I definitely think it's a step in the right direction, but it's also, again, you need this polarizable medium that's able to act out these, like, you have to, the next step is giving some structure to that background medium and how it connects atoms to one another. And like, there's huge physical questions at the heart of that as well.
Yeah, and there's some new research. I'm forgetting the name of the group right now, but they're doing a lot of papers suggesting that pilot wave, because it was always, well, what is this pilot wave, right? That the pilot wave, that actually the virtual particle fluctuations actually have the properties of what the pilot wave would have. I mean, it's only been the past couple decades that we've discovered that the quantum vacuum is entangled. which is what the pilot wave would be. It would be this infinitely entangled structure, the pilot wave. And now we're finding, oh, okay, yeah, I guess the quantum vacuum is infinitely entangled. And that the pilot wave, there's a lot of modeling suggesting that the pilot wave are the virtual photons, which isn't hard to wrap your head around, given that the virtual photons are the force carriers. They do control the interactions of all subatomic particles. So it's interesting that they're probing the nature of this quantum vacuum, and that is giving a bit of a clearer picture. It's approaching more of a picture that I think more aligns with the Bohmian, the physical view of the pilot wave theory.
I mean, it's really cool stuff. We have a lot left to investigate, and it's obviously a huge world. I think that in the next few decades of physics, there's going to be a pretty big turnaround in the conventional theories. And I think as those theories change, like if I've seen anything, I've seen that many people and theorists build their ideas off of what quantum physics says is possible. And so, as we start to understand the quantum world better, the world of atoms and photons and everything else, like, I think that we're going to start to see a different kind of science emerge from it, because by necessity, the model at the foundation feeds everything that's built on top of it. And so, like you said, you're like, I'm not inventing a new theory. I'm trying to map what's happening onto the theory that is accepted. And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly right. So refining the theory that's at the foundation of everything brings everything else into focus for the people that build on top of that. Because if the world of the particle zoo doesn't make sense, or if there's some kind of piece that's missing of this like continuum mechanics, then the shift towards continuum mechanics will suddenly make everything else clear. It'll be the ratchet to get everybody into some view where they're like, oh wow, these things that we didn't think were possible might actually be possible. And so I think you're doing cool work. It's really at the edge of things, and I think that being driven by questions of experience is really valuable for science, because too often the questions of experience are forbidden to be explored. And I'm like, I think that might not be that wise.
I agree wholeheartedly. Totally. Yeah.
Where can people? Do you want to tell people before we let you go, like where they can follow up on your work? You have a website, right?
Yeah, I always direct people to the website, psychicphysics.com. And no spaces, just psychicphysics.com. You'll find a link to a documentary that we did, just giving a overall sort of thematic view of this theory and just a broad perspective on the ideas. If you want to dive a little bit deeper, I have a talks page as well there, where you can see the presentation I gave at the 2024 Science of Consciousness, where I have references. You can download the presentation as well with all of the references, that sort of walks you through a little bit more scientifically what the theory is proposing and what some of the supporting evidence for it is. And then also on the website, you have an infographic. It's like a little two-pager that sort of summarizes the mechanism in a kind of simple way. And people can contact me there through the website as well. Yeah.
Awesome. By the way, are you taking grad students?
No, I am teaching undergraduate students right now. Yeah.
I know. Some people are always looking for good mentors out there. We're constantly bumping shoulders with people at different stages in the academic pipeline. So
Yeah, and I'm still growing and learning. I think the hard thing about this theory is it spans three disciplines: biology, the chemistry, the spin chemistry of the quantum antenna, and the physics of the relativistic quantum information. And no one can be an expert in all of those fields. So I myself, I've been taking courses in RQI and going deeper into those papers and studies to sort of at least give a high level framework. I'm working on a paper right now of the framework for VOS. It's called vacuum orchestrated spin signaling, the theory. in the hopes that that might entice other experts within those fields to take a look at it and further the work themselves. So that's the hope.
Very cool. Well, yeah, it was great to meet you, Tiffany. Thanks for giving us your time, and
Yeah,
I
thank
feel
you
like I
for
have
that.
a lot of things to contemplate now this afternoon. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've given me a lot to think about as well. So it's been a very stimulating conversation. So thank you for the opportunity.
All right, good luck, and let's stay in touch.
Will do.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks so.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.